All right, talking about public opinion, chapter 6, part 3, stereotypes, chapter 6, stereotypes. And right off the bat, I just want to make the comment that this was kind of there's a little bit of a challenge for me on this one, and not, not the most challenging thing that I've ever read, but just sort of different. It was unique to this book in the sense that up until this point, everything that I'd seen, I've talked so highly of this, and the previous chapter being noting this is some of the best writing that I've ever seen anywhere. And so, I don't know, the way that I'm kind of thinking about this chapter was that it seemed familiar, but maybe in a new form, or familiar but somehow different than things that I've seen before. Whereas a lot of the information prior to this were things that I've contemplated before, and I could very easily see the thinking, or I've had those thoughts before. So this is sort of the first time where I'm introduced to ideas that are kind of uniquely Lippmann, that just require me to think a little bit deeper about them. And so last thing I'll note on that is, I think either that kind of gut reaction, that a little bit of unfamiliarity or newness to it indicates a new realm that's associated with those other thoughts that I feel very strongly about, and that I have come to conclusions about. And so this might help provide direction to a new aspect of my thinking or my arguments or anything like that. Or this could represent a possible divergence from Lippmann in my thinking. However, I think it's probably the former rather than the latter. So to get into it, each of us lives and works on a small part of the Earth's surface, moves in a small circle, and of these acquaintances know only a few intimately. Of any public event that has wide effects, we see at best only a phase and an aspect. And that's true of the insiders who draft treaties, make laws, and issue orders, as it is of those who have treaties framed for them, laws promulgated to them, and orders given at them. And so inevitably our opinions cover a bigger space, a longer reach of time, and a greater number of things than we can directly observe. They have, therefore, to be pieced together out of what others have reported and what we can imagine. And so to add to this, and it comes up later, so one of the things here is that of any circumstance, and even consider present moment, right? Any moment in time, we as an individual, we can only perceive it through our lens, right? And so we can only see it, a phase or an aspect of it. And to build on that, we can only see a phase or an aspect of it, and it's tainted by our preconceptions and experience. So one thing, right, is, and this comes to a mindset shift. You have to be thinking about how your experience influences your thoughts. So, for example, one of the things that he addresses is the oldest brother or the older brother who doesn't have any older siblings cannot know what it's like to be the younger sibling. So I think about my experience versus my youngest brother's, who has only older brothers and no younger siblings. He only knows what it's like to be the youngest. And the same goes for, right, the people who write the laws versus the people who enforce the laws versus the people abiding the laws. We all have different relationships to these. And one more piece to that. Think about the way that, like, the law being the thing that the event, like a new law is passed, right, or whatever. It doesn't even have to be a new law, but the lawmaker makes a law. The law, interestingly, applies to everybody, right? And so everyone is a participant in abiding or, following this law. But let's say it's a more general one. It has room for interpretation. The person who wrote the law is going to have a much deeper, intimate understanding of the interpretation. And that can play out in a number of ways. Let's say on a cynical side, that person drafts a law and it allows them, they know where the line is that you can't cross, or they know the technicalities that helps them sort of not break the law, but act in a deceiving way. So a lot of tax regulation, I would say, is kind of in the same vein as what I'm talking about right now, versus the kind of the common man who has no familiarity with the law in its technical development or application, but is just a law-abiding citizen, right? They're just they only know it as the way it's interpreted to them. So they have a completely different relationship to the event or the concept. So even the eyewitness does not bring back a naive picture of the scene, for experience seems to show that he himself brings something to the scene, which later he takes away from it. That oftener than not, what he imagines to be the account of an event is really a transfiguration of it. And so this is an interesting one. And when I first read it, this was the interpretation I had. So you're in a scene, right, where you're observing through your eyes this unfolding happening. But where you are in the room and the immediate people around you and the setting, right, they all influence your perception of that event. Notably, another observer in that room through their eyes is seeing you in that environment. That's something that you can't do. And so your presence in the environment changes it, and you can't perceive that. So that was my initial thought. I think that the point of that claim is actually slightly different, but I still felt like my interpretation there is valuable for maybe different reasons. So, and let me just say right now, what's coming up is an example of this psychology conference, and that example is probably more aligned to what I read versus my interpretation. A report is the joint product of the knower and known, in which the role of the observer is always selective and usually creative. The facts we see depend on where we are placed and the habits of our eyes. An unfamiliar scene is like the baby's world, one great blooming, buzzing confusion. Foreign languages, for example, that we do not understand always seem like gibbering babblings in which it is impossible to fix a definite, clear-cut, individualized group of sounds. Only gross differences of size or color are perceived by an outsider in a flock of sheep, each of which is perfectly individualized to the shepherd. I always really make a point to note out metaphors or examples given that include sheep and shepherds and stuff, because I think that they so symbolically embody societal thinking. And I think that this is another great point of that. Like, if the society is the sheep, and right, we want to not have a society of sheep, but to an outsider looking in, maybe you could say, the awakened people who are not sheep on the outside looking in, they all look the same. That's not a great one, especially because to the shepherd, each of the sheep are individualized. They know them. They have their own identity to them. So I think this is more to say, yeah, I don't know, whatever. I'm going to move on. The problem of the acquisition of meaning by things, or stated another way, of forming habits of simple apprehension, is thus the problem of introducing 1, definiteness and distinction, and 2, consistency or stability of meaning into what is otherwise vague and wavering. But the kind of definiteness and consistency introduced depends upon who introduces them. In a later passage, Dewey gives an example of how differently an experienced layman and a chemist might define the word metal. Smoothness, hardness, glossiness, and brilliancy, heavy weight for its size, the serviceable properties of capacity for being hammered and pulled without breaking, of being softened by heat and hardened by cold, of retaining the shape and form given, of resistance to pressure and decay, would probably be included in the layman's definition. But the chemist would likely as not ignore these aesthetic and utilitarian qualities and define a metal as, quote, any chemical element that enters into combination with oxygen so as to form a base, end quote. For the most part, we do not first see and then define, we define first and then see. So let me comment on that. And one thought that I had while reading the metal definition of metal example was, like, for some reason, my mind went to teaching and education. So again, and it's kind of part of public conversation right now, but the way that we teach is so weird and one-sided. And so, yes, in chemistry, we talked about metals. We talk about it through a strictly through a chemist's perspective. So it seems odd to me that in our science classes, in our science education, that we would take that position and totally eliminate the practical applications of that, chemical definition. Why would we not be presenting both sides of this? Because you know, it's not that either are right or wrong, it's a matter of perspective. And so the reason why this stands out to me is I grew up going to a school with a lot of people that were from blue-collar families or would go on to blue-collar trades, and would have taken away a lot of value from a science, like a chemistry class, that taught from both sides. Here is the metal, here's its definition, here it's what it's composed of, and here's how you can take that understanding of its composition and this scientific definition and apply it in the real world. And so that the chemistry of, I guess that's maybe applied chemistry. So it's just, I don't know, an interesting distinction that throughout our general education, K through 12, we rarely get into applied practices of these concepts. And, right, like, you know, tech ed, shop class, right, that's a kind of nationwide issue of those courses being eliminated or shrunken or defunded. If we can't have those, can we make it up in the aggregate? Can we provide education in the general education that includes that, so that, or an option to include it, so that students can learn the same things but through the lens that is most relatable to them? And then, for the most part, we do not see first and then define. We define first and then see. I think that's a very elegantly simple way of a really big idea, saying a big idea. So, at a Congress of Psychology in Göttingen, an interesting experiment was made with a crowd of presumably trained observers. This is a big one, and this goes back to that original comment before. Not far from the hall in which the Congress was sitting, there was a public fete with a masked ball. Suddenly, the door of the hall was thrown open, and a clown rushed in madly, pursued by a Negro, revolver in hand. They stopped in the middle of the room fighting. The clown fell, the Negro leapt upon him, fired, and then both rushed out of the hall. The whole incident hardly lasted 20 seconds. The president asked those present to write immediately a report, since there was sure to be a judicial inquiry. 40 reports were sent in. Only one had less than 20% of mistakes in regard to the principal facts. 14 had 20 to 40% of mistakes, 12 from 40 to 50%, 13 more than 50%. Moreover, in 24 accounts, 10% of the details were pure inventions. And this proportion was exceeded in 10 accounts and diminished in 6. Briefly, a quarter of the accounts were false. It goes without saying that the whole scene had been arranged and even photographed in advance. The 10 false reports may then be relegated to the category of tales and legends. 24 accounts are half legendary, and 6 have a value approximating to exact evidence. Thus, out of 40 trained observers writing a responsible account of a scene that had just happened before their eyes, more than a majority saw a scene that had not taken place. What then did they see? One would suppose it was easier to tell what had occurred than to invent something which had not occurred. They saw their stereotype of such a brawl. All of them had in the course of their lives acquired a series of images of brawls, and these images flickered before their eyes. In one man, these images displace less than 20% of the actual scene. In 13 men, more than half. In 34 out of 40 observers, the stereotypes preempted at least 1/10 of the scene. So that's insane. And I have a number of thoughts about this, but essentially, I mean, I guess the point being made here is how radically, well, one, how unreliable our memory is, which is a growing understanding that it's part of the public conversation. Our memory is extremely flawed, susceptible to being changed, and imagery is at the center of this. And I find that fascinating because I'm still hooked on this idea of aphantasia. And so it makes me curious when so many people rely on visual components for memory, and how much that seems to change the memory. Like, again, and these are supposed to be 40 people who are good at that. And so one, it just makes this is a very interesting study, and I would like to, it would be interesting to see more studies like this, where you have a staged event where you can, it's like you write out the script of this event. So you have the actual facts of what is going to happen. And then you play out the event in real time in front of a group and have them immediately write to recall the event and to talk about it. I think it's a great example. It would provide a snapshot of what happens in the media. And then last thing I'm going to note on that visual versus the aphantasia distinction. So I had another thing come up recently where I just wonder if an inability to visualize makes someone better at cutting through the bullshit and having potentially more accurate accounts of things. And as I say that, I wonder if maybe the trade, because there's got to be a trade-off, I assume. I wonder if the trade-off is that with a visual memory, you can recall more things, but without visual memory, you recall fewer things to more accuracy. The truth is even broader than that, for the stereotyped shapes lent to the world come not merely from art in the sense of painting and sculpture and literature, but from our moral codes and social philosophies and our political agitations as well. Substitute in the following passage of Mr. Brenson's the words politics, business, and society for the word art, and the sentence will be no less true. Here's the quote. Unless years devoted to the study of all schools of art, so politics, business, or society, have taught us also to see with our own eyes, we soon fall into the habit of molding whatever we look at into the forms borrowed from the one art with which we are acquainted. There is our standard of artistic reality. End quote. Mr. Berenson speaks of our displeasure when a painter does not visualize objects exactly as we do, and of the difficulty of appreciating the art of the Middle Ages, because since then our manner of visualization forms has changed in 1,000 ways. So it's like, unless you're practiced in seeing things through your own eyes, your own perspective, right, and being able to adequately remove these stereotypes kind of pressed onto our mind, unless you can avoid that, unless you can intentionally avoid that, you are just creating reconstructions of these stereotypes that came from people visualizing through their own eyes. So this will come full circle, but it looks like we go a different direction for a second. If we cannot fully understand the acts of other people until we know what they think they know, then in order to do justice, we have to appraise not only the information which has been at their disposal, but the minds through which they have filtered it. So Americanization, for example, is superficially at least the substitution of American for European stereotypes. Thus, the peasant who might see his landlord as if he were the lord of the manor, his employer as he saw the local magnate, is taught by Americanization to see the landlord and employer according to American standards. This constitutes a change of mind, which is, in effect, when the inoculation succeeds, a change of vision. His eyes see differently. One kindly gentlewoman has confessed that the stereotypes are of such overweening importance that when hers are not indulged, she at least is unable to accept the brotherhood of man and fatherhood of God. We are strangely affected by the clothes we wear. Garments create a mental and social atmosphere. What can be hoped for the Americanism of a man who insists on employing a London tailor? So this comes into play. So until we know what they think they know, and how these stereotypes, these images kind of get projected onto things, and it's a very kind of a natural thing. Like, so the clothes you wear, right, there's the Italian style, right? If you go across the world, there are different trends and things like that. And so there is, of course, some connection between the scene outside and the mind through which we watch it, just as there are some long-haired men and short-haired women in radical gatherings. But to the hurried observer, a slight connection is enough. If there are 2 bobbed heads and 4 beards in the audience, it will be a bobbed and bearded audience to the reporter who knows beforehand that such gatherings are composed of people with these tastes in the management of their hair. Another version of this would be the long-haired hippies of the 60s, right? And it's a weird sort of generalization of movements. Like the hippies alone is a generalization of this, like, kind of Enlightenment push of that era, of a post-war era. And the long-haired assignment is done by, observers generalizing the population of, people in those movements. There is a connection between our vision and the facts, but it is often a strange connection. In untrained observation, we pick recognizable signs out of the environment. The signs stand for ideas, and these ideas we fill out with our stock of images. We do not so much see this man and that sunset. Rather, we notice that the thing is man or some sunset, and then see chiefly what our mind is already full of on those subjects. There is economy in this, for the attempt to see all things freshly and in detail, rather than as types and generalities, is exhausting and among busy affairs practically out of the question. In a circle of friends and in relation to close associates or competitors, there is no shortcut through and no substitute for an individualized understanding. Those whom we love and admire most are the men and women whose consciousness is peopled thickly with persons rather than with types, who know us rather than the classification into which we might fit. So the idea being, right, to some degree, that the generalizations that we make, they are natural and pretty, it's in the name of efficiency. It's pretty helpful for us to be able to navigate the world and not be overwhelmed. But on the flip side, for the things that really matter, the people we love and admire, like those close associates or friends and family, right? It's about knowing the individual, the persons, rather than the types, right? Rather than the type classifications that they fall into. But modern life is hurried and multifarious. Above all, physical distance separates men who are often in vital contact with each other, such as employer and employee, official and voter. There is neither time nor opportunity for intimate acquaintance. Instead, we notice a trait which marks a well-known type and fill in the rest of the picture by means of the stereotype we carry about in our heads. He is an agitator, that much we notice or are told. Well, an agitator is this sort of person, and so he is this sort of person. He is an intellectual. He is a plutocrat. He is a foreigner. And definition of a plutocrat is a person whose power derives from their wealth. I just want to know that. I think that's an important definition today. So the subtlest and most pervasive of all influences are those which create and maintain the repertoire of stereotypes. We are told about the world before we see it. We imagine most things before we experience them. And those preconceptions, unless education has made us acutely aware, govern deeply the whole process of perception. They mark out certain objects as familiar or strange, emphasizing the difference so that the slightly familiar is seen as very familiar and somewhat strange as sharply alien. And so if we depend on these, and these in the end depend upon those inclusive patterns which constitute our philosophy of life. If in that philosophy we assume that the world is codified according to a code which we possess, we are likely to make our reports of what is going on describe a world run by our code. So whether or not the world is actually operating by our code, by the philosophy that a nation, an individual, or whatever chooses to adopt, we will justify it, that the happenings of the world, through that code. But if our philosophy tells us that each man is only a small part of the world, that his intelligence catches at best only phases and aspects in a coarse net of ideas, then when we use our stereotypes, we tend to know that they are only stereotypes, to hold them lightly, to modify them gladly. We tend also to realize more and more clearly when our ideas started, where they started, how they came to us, why we accepted them. All useful history is antiseptic in this fashion. It enables us to know what fairy tale, what school book, what tradition, what novel, play, picture, phrase planted one preconception in this mind and another in that mind. I think that's awesome. So the idea being, if your philosophy doesn't have that understanding of our intelligence is limited to our time, place, and observation, right? And that's susceptible to flaws and stereotypes and bias and things like that. If your philosophy doesn't embody that, then it's a philosophy which is an ideal that you will justify by tweaking the events that unfold, rather than observing an event and describing it for what it is. You make it bend to the will of your philosophy. But the latter, and something that I've experienced personally, is the enablement of knowing where ideas started, how they came to us, why they were accepted. And I've been doing this while watching Game of Thrones for the first time. Being able to point out why, certain the Lannisters' military takes a certain formation because it's inspired by Rome and the Roman gladiators, or philosophically too, analyzing Jon Snow versus Daenerys versus the Lannisters. Those who wish to censor art do not at least underestimate this influence. They generally misunderstand it, and almost always they are absurdly bent on preventing other people from discovering anything not sanctioned by them. But at any rate, like Plato in his argument about the poets, they feel vaguely that the types acquired through fiction tend to be imposed on reality. So in the Republic, there is a conversation about poets and censorship in a way, which is centered around the idea that being kind of part of the popular culture, the poets have an influence on society and the reality of that society, the interpretation of that society. And so in a way, the writings of the poets have a way of bringing to life those ideals. And so there was an argument for the censorship of poets because their uncensored vision has the possibility of tainting the social mentality, ideas. Thus, there can be little doubt that the moving picture is steadily building up imagery, which is then evoked by the words people read in the newspapers. In the whole experience of the race, there has been no aid to visualization comparable to cinema. What I want to note here too, and this is, again, so the influence that these mediums have on our thinking. And I do believe in that, and that is substantiated by everything that's being said here, and Plato too, and that right, I've talked about how you are what you consume. And so your mind is made up of what you consume, just as your body is made up of what you eat. And so in that sense, reality TV would be like the Twinkies of information that you consume. And so, and the imagery sort of conditions you to certain things. There's this idea that it's a conspiracy theory that the government operates, works in conjunction with movie and TV studios to produce things that will help the public understand how to interpret it. And so the idea being, like, if the government is aware of some bad thing that's going to happen, the example used was like aliens, that like they work with them to kind of show what that scenario would look like, and like how ways that you can operate in such a scenario. That's poorly explained, but I'm going to move on. But here, and then this one. If a Florentine wished to visualize the saints, he could go to the frescoes in his church, where he might see a vision of saints standardized for his time by Giotto. If an Athenian wished to visualize the gods, he went to the temples. But the number of objects which were pictured was not great. And so the idea here is like, prior to art, and now like the history, as we've accumulated so many different art forms and visual representations, it's hard for us to break the mold of the original stereotypes. That think about the iconography of the church, the visuals, the symbols, saints, angels, Jesus, like those were established at a particular point in time as someone visualized them at that point in time. But now, so far down the road, and because it's been reinforced over time, those visualizations have prevented us from visualizing them in any other interpretation. And at this point, it's almost offensive to believe that you could visualize them in a different way. In the Western world, however, during the last few centuries, there has been an enormous increase in the volume and scope of secular description. The word picture, the narrative, the illustrated narrative, and finally the moving picture, and perhaps the talking picture. Photographs have the kind of authority over imagination today which the printed word had yesterday, and the spoken word before that. They seem utterly real. And so when we speak of the mind of a group of people, of the French mind, the militarist mind, the Bolshevik mind, we are liable to serious confusion unless we agree to separate the instinctive equipment from the stereotypes, the patterns, and the formulae which play so decisive a part in building up the mental world to which the native character is adapted and responds. Failure to make this distinction accounts for oceans of loose talk about collective minds, national souls, and race psychology. To be sure, a stereotype may be so consistently and authoritatively transmitted in each generation from parent to child that it seems almost like a biological fact. In some respects, we may indeed have become as Mr. Wallace says, biologically parasitic upon our social heritage, but certainly that there is not the least scientific evidence which would enable anyone to argue that men are born with the political habits of the country in which they are born, insofar as political habits are alike in a nation. The first places to look for an explanation are the nursery, the school, the church, not in that limbo inhabited by group minds, groupthink, and national souls, until you have thoroughly failed to see tradition being handed on from parents, teachers, priests, and uncles. It is a solecism of the worst order to ascribe political differences to the germplasm. The older son never does have the experience of being the younger, and therefore, until we are able to discount the difference in nurture, we must withhold judgment about the differences of nature. So, right, and so this is where I kind of get into speak of the mind of a group of people, of the French mind, the military, right? I think there too, this idea, as I've been exploring Marx, right, and the stereotypes and the collective vision that we have around Marx, and again, he has always been kind of mentioned in the same breath as some of the worst, most evil people in history. And that visual, like speaking that way about him, and that connection, using those words and that connection, assigns a visualization of the Nazi flag or whatever. But if we can't isolate his thoughts and not generalize, then I don't know. So, and then I was also thinking about reliable confusion. If we don't make that distinction, loose talk about collective minds, national souls, and race psychology. Yeah. So if all we do is speak in generalized terms, that's how we end up in race psychology. And I just really want to note that. I think I can provide a follow-up to that, but so let's work that back. So today, the woke culture talks about a lot of race stuff, critical race theory being one of them, which would be a failure to recognize the separation of the instinctive equipment from the stereotypes. Right. So maybe the fault here being that by looking at the collective plight of races, let's say, the shared experience, that's super generalized, and it actually doesn't hold water today, because that shared experience was eliminated, generations ago. So there is a connection to that, but that is not the experience today in this moment. And so then it forces that collective mindset, because the arguments that they're making only hold in a collective sense. If you go to the individual, it breaks down. All right. And then the nurture aspect too. The nursery, the school, the church. Which increasingly embody that, like, just passing down tradition and these generalizations. There was a better line before about what would be more ideal. Like, I feel like the school setting should be about an intentional effort in that period and for that limited part of your day to examine closely, right? We talk about the economic, the economy of mind, how exhausting it would be to think in that term all day long, sure. But school should be about recognizing that, I don't know, whatever, I'm gonna be done.